All right, we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Articulate Ancient History. We're very excited to have you join us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognize their continuing support to land, water, and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country of which you're on and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. As we mark 175 years at the University of Sydney's history, we acknowledge that this place has always been a place of learning and knowledge exchange for over 60,000 years, and wisdom has been passed through many generations. Of tonight, I will quickly run through some housekeeping, and then we will proceed with a talk on ethics and human remains in museums. There will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function at any stage to submit questions. We will try to get through as many as we can. However, feel free to email our team if there is something that we do not cover tonight. The webinar will be recorded and we'll be sharing it with everyone who has registered, and we'll also be adding it to our learning resources page where it will be free for everyone to access. We have also enabled closed captions for tonight, so please feel free to click on the show captions icon to view. And as I said, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydneyedu.au. I'm very proud to say that tonight's webinar is delivered in partnership with our Chau Chak Wing Museum at the university, and it wouldn't have been possible without Dr. Craig Barker and Dr. Melanie Pitkin and their ongoing support to keep delivering talks relevant to high school audiences. Thank you so much for sharing your research and teaching insights with us. Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you for joining us, everybody. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the countries from which you're meeting. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney CBD. I'd like to congratulate all of you for being wise in choosing to study ancient history. It's a wonderful subject. There are wonderful opportunities for you to pursue it further at university, both through museums, as both Melanie and I do, but also through academic and all sorts of other career options. But the amazing skill that you're going to learn through studying ancient history is to question, to analyze, to evaluate, and to interpret. And these are such valuable skills across a whole range of different industries that there'll be a little bit of ancient history with you for the rest of your career and the rest of your lives. One of the other things that ancient history will teach you, and particularly with the way the New South Wales syllabus is written, is also to think about some of the broader impacts of ancient history on the modern world, and think about some of the impacts of the decisions that we're making today have upon our own heritage and cultural backgrounds. For someone like myself, coming from a museum and archaeology background, these are increasingly more and more important thoughts. I was just thinking the other day, I can't think of anything else that's changed so radically during my career as an archaeologist as has been the way that we have approached human remains. And this is at every level of heritage management, but particularly noticeable within museums. So it's my great honor to introduce tonight's presenter. Great privilege to introduce a colleague, but a friend as well, who's really at the forefront of some of these international conversations. The Chau Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney is our museum collection of more than 400,000 items from around the globe, including ancient historical material from Egypt, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and it does include human remains. Melanie, Dr. Melanie Pitkin, is the senior curator of the Nicholson collection at the Chau Chak Wing Museum, and she is responsible for that antiquities collection and some of the curatorial decisions made around what we do with it. She has extensive experience working in museums here in Australia and in the United Kingdom, and in providing support for colleagues at museums in Egypt, very much partnerships, as you'll hear about tonight. Melanie holds a PhD in Egyptology and an honours degree from Macquarie University, and has a Masters of Museum Studies from here at the University of Sydney. Melanie's been working with the Chau Chak Wing Museum team now since February 2022. Before that, she was a research associate with the Egyptian Antiquities Department at the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And there she played a key role in the museum's cutting-edge interdisciplinary research into the coffins held in that collection in Britain. Before that, she'd worked for more than a decade at the Powerhouse Museum, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences here in Sydney. Melanie's academic research interests include Egyptian funerary stele and Egyptian funerary coffins, funerary archaeology more broadly, and the reuse, recycling, and modification of objects in ancient Egypt. Melanie, as you'll hear tonight, is particularly committed to community outreach, and this can be witnessed by the launching of the Chau Chak Wing Museum's pop-up museum project back in 2022. She's also, last year, I should say. She's also interested in museum curatorial practices, and as we're going to hear about this afternoon, the ethical care and treatment of human remains. Part of this commitment has been the launch of the Human Remains Research Project at the Chau Chak Wing Museum, which is the topic of tonight's presentation. Thank you, Melanie. I think we all look forward to learning more from you about this really important subject.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Craig, for the kind introduction. And thank you so much to Joyce and her team in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for organising this opportunity. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all to present to you this evening what is a sensitive and controversial topic, which I'm really pleased to see form part of the high school curriculum. And that is the ethical considerations for the care and management of human remains in museums in the field. My talk today will be arranged into 3 parts. In part 1, I'm going to begin by setting the scene in very practical terms, by getting you to think about some of the complexities of this topic from the perspective of a museum curator. So getting you to essentially step into my shoes. I'll then give you some brief background into the history of acquiring, studying and displaying human remains at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. I'll explain the importance of our study and why it's being undertaken in the context of existing guidelines and previous research, before focusing explicitly on Egyptian mummified human remains, framing the issues in terms of why the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead. We'll look at terminology and historical attitudes. But the bulk of this presentation will focus on our human remains research project and how we are addressing these complexities through pioneering community-centred approaches, which brings together the attitudes and voices of our museum visitors and Egyptian descent communities in the context of the current and changing discourse, and what other museums are doing elsewhere in order to make better informed decisions around caring for and displaying human remains in museums. And please be advised that this presentation does contain images of ancient Egyptian mummified human remains. Next slide, please. So I'd like you to imagine yourselves in this situation. You've just been appointed as the senior curator of the Chau Chak Wing Museum's Antiquities and Archaeology collection. And in the first week of your appointment, you've begun receiving some concerning feedback about the newly opened Egyptian galleries. More specifically, next slide, the display of ancient Egyptian mummified body parts. This includes a pair of infant's legs inside a bell jar in the bottom right centre, mummified hands, one of which is displayed inside a branded Arnott's biscuit tin, as well as a mummified foot and head. So this is in the mummy room. So I'm not sure how many of you have visited our museum before, but we have 2 dedicated galleries to ancient Egypt. Next slide. As well as another mummified foot inside a branded Arnott's biscuit tin, and 2 mummified hands in Pharaonic Obsessions, Ancient Egypt and Australian Story. The responses received vary from, "This makes me feel really uncomfortable," and "I find this really triggering," to "I don't understand why they need to be on display." So how are you going to respond? Next slide. So this is my situation in February 2022. As soon as I had accepted my new role at the museum, I had inherited the responsibility of managing these past decisions, which at the time were justified to me as helping to tell the story of 19th and 20th century attitudes to mummified remains and collecting practices, deemed to have been done in a respectful manner in line with the International Council of Museums, ICOM's Code of Ethics. Now, it's widely understood that the decision of whether or not to display human remains is a particularly sensitive and problematic one. There is no general consensus. Attitudes are constantly shifting, and every museum around the world does things rather differently. Next slide. For me, although pressured with some anecdotal feedback at the time to remove the body parts from display, which other museums have done before, such as in Manchester, but to a great public outcry because of the lack of consultation, it instead became an opportunity to develop pioneering community-centered approaches to ethical engagements with ancient Egyptian human remains, and to ask more critical and reflective questions, especially around decision-making praxes and frameworks, including ICOM's Code of Ethics itself, which I'll come back to shortly. And so the Human Remains Research Project was born, an international collaborative research project between the Chau Chak Wing Museum at Sydney University, Macquarie University, and I'd like to give a shout out to my collaborators there, Professor Veronica Power and Jacinta Carruthers, University College London with Professor Alice Stevenson, and for the Egypt component of this work, which I'm focusing on today, the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Egypt. Next slide. As some background, the Chau Chak Wing Museum at Sydney University brings together 3 historic collections under one roof. The Nicholson Collection of Antiquities and Archaeology, which is what I look after, the Macleay Collection of Natural History, Ethnography, Historical Photographs and Scientific Instruments, and the University Art Collection. The museum's human remains, defined as bodies and parts of bodies of once living people, and not only from Egypt, but also from Cyprus, France, and the West Bank or Jericho for the Nicholson Collection. We also have Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander old peoples, people from the Pacific Islands, the Czech Republic, and Peru in the Macleay Collection. But other human remains are also cared for across the campus, and these are at the Shellshire and Wilson Museums and the Charles Perkins Centre, attached to our Faculty of Medicine, and also the Department of Archaeology. Next slide. The earliest human remains to enter the collection came from Egypt via Sir Charles Nicholson, founder of the Nicholson Museum and one of the co-founders of the University of Sydney, pictured here on the left. The most complete of the mummified individuals in the collection include the body of a woman, possibly Meroë herself, in her yellow anthropoid coffin, dating to the 3rd Intermediate Period, so around 1000 BC. The body of Menethotest in the late period, disturbed and disarticulated in her coffin. The body of a woman, possibly from the Roman period, found erroneously interred in the earlier 3rd Intermediate Period coffin of Patiashakhet, and the body of a young boy named Horus, also from the Roman period. Next slide. So what do we know about each of these individuals? Obviously, we can glean a lot from the text and decoration on the coffin sets themselves, at least when the right body is interred in the right coffin. Now, it's important to understand that in the early antiquities market, it was more profitable to have any body inside a coffin than none at all. In the case of Meroë, this is how we know her name and her occupations in life, as you can see on the screen. She was a Shemite, which was a chantress or singer in the temple of Amun at Karnak, an adherent of Mut, who was the consort of Amun, and a mistress of the house, so a lady who was married and could own property. But by studying the physical remains, through, for example, non-invasive imaging techniques like X-radiography and CT scanning, we can find out more in terms of her approximate age at death, how Meroë was mummified, and any particular health conditions or ailments that she had. On this basis, we know that Meroë was a young adult, at least 25 years old at death. Original X-radiography results suggested that the body was actually a male individual, but later CT scanning confirmed a female, based on the larger size of the pelvis. There is extensive post-mortem damage to the whole skeleton, which possibly occurred during mummification, but most likely through the rough handling process on its voyage to Sydney. The brain and internal organs have been removed, and the pelvic, abdominal, and thoracic cavities are filled with packing material. There is no evidence of any amulets or cultural artifacts, and a layer of mud has been smeared around the entire body to create a protective shell, otherwise known as a carapace. There are also signs of mild scoliosis, which is slight curvature to the spine. Next slide. Then we have the jumbled and disarticulated remains of the adult female Menethotest, who is in a very poor state of preservation, her coffin being robbed in the past, possibly in antiquity and or historical times. You'll also see that her body is compacted down one end of the coffin, probably the result of transporting her coffin head down on the sea voyage from London to Sydney. Study of the remaining bones suggests that Manetha Tess was recovering from cribra orbitalia lesions in her eye sockets. This is a condition associated with malnutrition and other deficiencies. There is also considerable wear of her surviving teeth. While loose faience beads suggest that her body was once covered by a colourful beaded net, and large amounts of resin found inside would have been used as a preserving agent in the mummification process. Next slide, please. The unnamed woman inside Paddy Ashuquet's coffin is thought to date from the Roman period. Based on the size of her pelvis and genitalia, we can confirm she's an adult female, older than 25 years at death. However, CT scans taken back in the 1990s, when the resolution wasn't as clear as the technology allows it to be today, led researchers to conclude that the body was actually a male, a length of textile which had dropped between the legs being suggestive at that time of the male genitalia. She is very well mummified, her organs have been removed, and there is good skin and soft tissue preservation over much of the body. Her chin rests on her chest, and there is significant tooth loss. While it's very difficult to determine cause of death, the presence of a large abscess in the lower jaw cannot exclude the possibility that she may have died of septicemia, or blood poisoning. Our next slide. Then we come to Horace, who was around 7 to 7.5 years old at death. Again, improvements in CT scanning technology only relatively recently confirmed the gender of this child as being a male. Before 2009, based on a mistaken translation of a text placed inside the child's wrappings, which you can see in the bottom right, the left of the body, it's called the Book of Breathing. Researchers at the time, in the mid-19th century, when this body went to the British Museum before coming to Australia, there was a mistranslation made where they suggested that the name was actually a female, Heranth, by misreading the determinative. So what's actually happened is that the wrong identity and narrative was being told about this child in the museum for almost 150 years. So you can see that improvements in advanced imaging techniques enables us to find out much about an individual in both life and death. It can also give us entirely new information, and it can correct historical mistakes. However, some might also question whether or not it is ethical to display the imaging beneath the wrappings. How would you feel, for example, having one of your X-rays or CT scans on public show, especially without your consent? In the UK, with the Gold Mummies exhibition at the Manchester Museum, which was on show until April 2024, a decision was made to remove the CT scan visualizations to refocus the visitor's attention away from the voyeuristic internal gaze to the exterior person. Analysis of human remains can also be invasive, involving physical sampling to find out more information, such as in the case of DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating. And I'll come back to this point a bit later. Next slide. The Cornerstone Code of Ethical Conduct, referred to by museums across the world, which sets the minimum standards of professional practice and performance for museums and their staff, is ICOM's Code of Ethics. First adapted in 1986 and revised in 2004, and which is only just being revised now after more than 20 years, this document cites human remains in several clauses, but conflates human remains from different geographical and temporal contexts, and it uses vague and ambiguous language. For example, in clause 4.3, human remains must be presented with great tact and respect for the feelings of human dignity held by all peoples. Next slide. But as we have already started to see, respect and dignity can mean different things to different people. As Professor Alice Stevenson has also rightly observed, who is this respect and dignity being directed to? Is it to the living, or is it to the dead? And if it's to the living, then to which living communities? And who is giving consent to these displays? It's this ambiguity which is why museums caring for ancient Egyptian mummified human remains across the world all do things rather differently, and why opinions keep shifting. Next slide. Showing ethical concerns towards the dead is quite a recent phenomenon, one that emerged with the rise of archaeology as a scientific discipline, which came to see the study of human remains as an important source of scientific information, rather than one of ghoulish curiosity. This turning point probably emerged in the early 20th century, with the first X-rays of human remains undertaken by Australian-born anatomist and University of Sydney graduate Grafton Elliott Smith on the royal mummies in the Cairo Museum. but which really gained recognition in the 1960s and 1970s. Prior to this, Egyptian mummified human remains took on quite a different fascination by the West. Next slide. In 16th and 17th century Europe, for example, mummified remains are thought to have medicinal properties, so they were regularly ground down into powder for their supposed therapeutic effects. In the pre-Raphaelite era, so the mid to late 19th century, mummy brown became a particularly popular pigment made from powdered human remains. Next slide. As we enter the Victorian era with the advent of travel and Thomas Cook holiday packages, travellers wanted to collect souvenirs and keepsakes of their experiences, which often included human remains, for their ability to help connect them to a bygone era. Next slide. In fact, from as early as the 16th century, but especially during the Victorian era, travellers could visit mummy pits that were reported to contain hundreds and even thousands of mummified remains, piled up in large heaps in roughly hewn caverns below the desert surface. They gained a reputation as being the place to cater for those in want of a mummified body or body parts, at prices to suit any traveller's means. According to the Perth Daily News in 1907, the mummy of a pharaoh could be acquired for 200 British pounds, or a prince or military commander for 30 British pounds, a priest for 10 to 15 British pounds, or a lowly commoner for £1 and 10 shillings. Next slide. Popularity in mummified remains became so great with travellers that demand soon outstripped supply. And by the late 19th century, enterprising antiquities dealers were manufacturing fakes to satisfy tourist demands. Next slide. Another sensation of this era was mummy unwrapping parties, where ancient Egyptian mummified bodies were unwrapped for entertainment at private parties. Or, next slide, in the case of Margaret Murray at the University of Manchester in 1908, for entertainment and pioneering investigation. It even became desirable for attendees at these events to take away a body part as a special memento. By the beginning of the 20th century, mummified remains became a moral burden, although some still justified their actions as rescuing the remains, while in the case of unwrapping parties, these were justified by some as a form of resurrecting the bodies. However, having an ethical concern for the most part was not a consideration in these earlier centuries. As one French tourist reported in 1833, it would hardly be respectable to return from Egypt without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other. Next slide. But what did the ancient Egyptians want and expect of their mummified dead? Piecing together the evidence available to us, we know that the ancient Egyptians wanted to keep the body preserved, intact, in a state which was as lifelike and recognisable as possible. But despite these strong beliefs, they were frequently undermined by tomb robbery, which took place from the earliest of times in antiquity, and often by the very people responsible for burying them. The ancient Egyptians knew this was a problem, and they tried to overcome it. They introduced intricate tomb security measures, new types of burial interments, an obvious example being from the monolith visible pyramid structures to rock-cut tombs set deeply back, as you can see here in the Valley of the Kings, and even wrote threatening curses and warnings on tomb walls. Thus, it needs to be understood that within the context of this debate, ancient Egyptian mummified human remains have a long history of being disturbed and mistreated from antiquity within the context of their original burial through to modern times. Next slide. Now, something you might have picked up on in the language I've been using so far is my interchangeable use of terms to describe the subject matter of this talk, which has arisen out of the general discourse. According to a recent CNN report, and I'll ask you to click please, Joyce, relayed by the Museums Association in January 2023, for example, a number of cultural institutions in Britain now prefer to use terms such as mummified person or mummified remains, rather than mummy, in order to emphasise the humanity of the individual. Institutions are also keen to distance their collections from popular culture depictions of mummies as supernatural monsters, while the colonial associations of the word mummy, which derives from the Arabic word mamoya or bitumen, are also under scrutiny. But untangling and decolonising this language is not straightforward, and in the case of the National Museums of Scotland, for example, while they have removed the use of the word mummy to describe the individuals in their care, they continue to use it as a descriptive adjective for objects, such as mummy mask and mummy case. Next slide, please. Interestingly, if we turn to the ancient Egyptian language, they used the word chet, which is in the top left here, for the physical body or the corpse, which could be the body threatened by decay, and sah for the transformed eternal body after death, the body preserved to live forever. Perhaps here our closest equivalent to the modern usage of mummy. Next slide. There are limited published studies known which include the use of data sets drawing on first-hand audience engagements with museum exhibits incorporating human remains. The largest study from an Australian perspective is that of Jasmine Day's 1995 to 1996 work and published in 2006 called The Mummy's Curse. Day incorporated academic research with the survey responses of 790 museum visitors, interviews with staff and archival research, which recorded perspectives in Australia, the UK and the US. Day's work highlighted that the majority of respondents reacted positively to the incorporation of human remains in displays. However, it was also clear that there was a lack of knowledge associated with the context in which these human remains were acquired, as well as minimal knowledge regarding ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices. Next slide. Another project exploring responses to human remains in an Australian context, undertaken by core members of the present research team, was with the British Museum travelling exhibition Egyptian Mummies Exploring Ancient Lives, shown at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney in 2016 to 2017. In this survey, we asked visitors whether museums should be allowed to display human remains, what they thought of the way the physical mummified bodies and CT scans are displayed, whether or not the mummified remains seemed real to them, who they thought owns the mummified remains, what key messages they took away from the exhibition, and what they know about the work of Australian researchers in Egyptian archaeology. In order to have a comparative data set, the Chau Chak Wing Museum survey used the same questions employed in this study. Next slide. Between July and November 2022, we surveyed 200 visitors to the museum, including one control response. Data was collected via iPads from visitors when leaving the exhibition, so their memory was fresh from their visit. No one could participate retrospectively. Next slide. In terms of survey demographics, 62% of respondents were female, almost half of respondents were aged under 35, 78.5% had at least one university degree, and 97% of respondents were not museum members. While some visitors identify with more than one ethnicity, you can see here that the majority of respondents identified as Australian, Caucasian, English, or European. We'll now take a look at the key findings of this survey. Next slide. Key finding number 1. Respondents are fundamentally okay with the display of human remains, including CT scans, often providing that certain conditions are met. Next slide. Now, visitors being okay with the display of human remains is not surprising from a museum survey like this. These results are consistent with similar visitor studies, including the data from the Egyptian Mummies exhibition, Jasmine Day's study, and data published in the 2003 Department of Culture, Media and Sport report, which is on the screen here in the red box. But what are some divisive points in relation to this? Is how this is a much more contentious issue amongst Egyptian communities, which I'll return to shortly. How essentially the publics that we engage with in this survey still retain a bias in themselves, which we must keep in mind. And as Alice Stevenson notes, how museums are in fact responsible for creating this expectation and public attitude in the first place, although they are often blind to it. Next slide. So in our survey, we asked visitors, what do you think of the way the Egyptian mummified human remains are displayed? And what do you think of the way the CT scans are displayed? 62.5% of respondents gave a positive response to the display of Egyptian mummified human remains at the museum. 78.5%, so notice the increase here, gave a positive response to the display of CT scans. Most of the respondents explained that they did not have an issue with their display. They considered the display arrangement as respectful, adequate and easy to navigate, and humanising. They praised their historical value and the interpretation provided, as well as the cultural safety warning signs. Next slide. However, what was problematic among many of the comments was how supporting the display of human remains also came with a range of varying conditions. For example, agree, as it is for educational purposes, of course while respecting and not revealing too much of the human body to not make it disrespectful of the culture. As long as they are shown with respect and permission of relations, I think it is important to show how science and our species has evolved. Agree, as long as they are given consent by the cultural people they belong to. You could make it clearer that they have been ethically sourced. Otherwise, it looks like colonially stolen treasures. So you can start to see some of the contradictions at play here. And next slide. The second key finding. Although most of the respondents were okay with displaying human remains, they struggled to identify key messages. Next slide. The most frequent takeaway key message related to Egyptian funerary practices, Egyptian cultural and social practices, followed by a general interest of the past and history. Many visitors also commented on considering the display of human remains as being valuable for education and learning, but they could not provide any specific reflection on their own learning experience. Next slide. The third takeaway is that many respondents did not seem familiar with the current discourse surrounding the display of human remains. We found that many of the respondents had not contemplated this debate until they were prompted to complete the survey, bringing to the fore the role in which museums play in helping the visitor to enable them to think critically about museums, make informed decisions, and to meaningfully engage in ethics discourse. Next slide. Another important question associated with this third key finding was asking survey respondents who they believed owned the mummified remains. And this question precipitated polarizing responses. Most, or 69%, believe that the Egyptian government, Egypt, or the Egyptian people were the owners, followed by the museum, I don't know, nobody, or humanity. Next slide. Another core component of this project has been ongoing consultation with the Egyptian diaspora in Australia and Egyptians more broadly. Next slide. Focus groups undertaken in September 2022 with 17 members of the Egyptian diaspora from Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide highlighted strong feelings associated with the mummified human remains. I found the body parts irreverent and confronting. I found the severe cut of the body parts upsetting. I wanted answers to the different values of different body parts. Yet there was an innate sense of fascination as well, with some remarking that the displays and incorporation of 3D modelling and imaging were fascinating, and they couldn't believe the extent of objects contextualising these displays. Most of the group also commented how having Egyptian antiquities, including human remains at the museum, made them feel more connected to their native homeland. Next slide. In order to have a better balance of voices from within the community, we've also organised meet and greets where we invite local Egyptians to the museum to meet with curators and colleagues, participate in a short talk and tour, and complete an in-depth questionnaire for us. Although the survey is still open, findings to date show an even divide in attitudes towards the display of ancient Egyptian mummified human remains, but supplemented by many strong feelings of being conflicted. We then took the conversation further, next slide, to a publishable piece of the online media platform Egyptian Streets, posing the question, is there such a thing as the ethical display of human remains in museums? Drawing on the discussions raised in our focus groups, it was striking to see how this article triggered many strong reactive and emotive responses, although admittedly it is difficult to ascertain how many of these responses are from Egyptians in Egypt, the diaspora, or other readers altogether. For example, the main objective of ancient Egyptians was to have their names mentioned regularly, thus a museum stint does wonders for their eternal life. This is a great history and what we are doing is introducing this history to the world. Dead people don't get offended. Too late to complain now, don't you think? It's for Egyptians to decide. Next slide. So how do we implement this data, especially when you can see that there are conflicted feelings and there's a lack of consensus for both museum audiences and professionals alike? Next slide. First, in April last year, we published the globally first set of culturally specific guidelines for the care of ancient Egyptian mummified human remains, tailored to specifically care for those mummified remains at our museum, which is the first of its kind and is now published on our website. This provides us with a foundational document from which any decision is made concerning the care of Egyptian mummified human remains at our museum. Next slide. We've also developed an overarching set of guidelines, very recently published, which addresses all platforms of the museum. So not only collections, research, documentation, interpretation, and display, but also teaching, education and public programs, media, marketing, merchandising, and the web. Our work also considers the importance and uniqueness of local context, in this case, caring for international human remains on Gadigal land. As our dear colleague Dr. Caleb Hamilton from Aotearoa has eloquently observed, culturally respectful care is not universal, and that respectful treatment needs to align with the Indigenous knowledge holders of the land on which the international human remains are located. With this in mind, our guidelines have been formulated in close consultation with Indigenous law and consulting firm Terry Janke & Co., and within the framework of the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property, or ICIP. Next slide, please. With these guidelines as our foundational document and compass, we've also devised a 3-phase plan from 2024 to 2026, whose intention is to reframe existing narratives and ways of engaging with Egyptian mummified human remains. Phase 1 is the removal of the body parts on display in our Egyptian galleries and the installation of a new replacement display focused on funerary faces. One thing that's clear from our research findings is that changes need to be implemented incrementally and they need to be evaluated and reviewed as we go. Next slide, please. This phase was enacted on the 4th of April last year, and a label, please click Joyce, accompanying the new display acknowledges our research project, the removal of the body parts, and we also have a QR code for people to continue to provide feedback and to complete our questionnaire. Next slide. Phase 2 is to reframe the language and messaging seen across all physical and online platforms of the museum. In December this year, the Mummy Room will be renamed, and the gallery text rewritten to focus more on the different ancient, historical, and contemporary perspectives and complexities of displaying and caring for ancient Egyptian mummified human remains. Next slide. And phase 3 is to review, adapt, and implement this project model to the wider Nicholson collection of human remains from Cyprus, Jericho, and France. Next slide. And while undertaking this work, as I mentioned, the question that has continuously arisen, and which we've always been very mindful of, is what are they doing in Egypt? So in recent years, they've been displaying them, both digitally and in person. They are hosting grand international parades for their transfer. In this case, the relocation of the royal mummies from the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square to their new home at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Next slide. And they've been opening them on excavation sites in frenzied media spectacles. But this has not always been Egypt's stance. Next slide. In the 1980s, for example, President Anwar Sadat, pictured here, banned the royal mummies from being shown and they were placed in storage, arguing that it desecrated the dead. In fact, he wanted to rebury the mummies. Next slide. So to better address contemporary Egyptian attitudes in Egypt, we have developed a new strand of our research undertaking roundtable discussions with Egyptian colleagues in Egypt. The first of these was undertaken in October last year at the Conrad Hotel in Cairo. Key curators, conservators, academics, bioarchaeologists, and other specialists came together to discuss a range of different questions, of which I'd like to share with you some of the top-level highlights here. Okay, the first question. What are your views about Egyptian human remains being on display in Egyptian museums and overseas? It probably won't surprise you that there was a complete spectrum of opinions. Some were deeply for, some were deeply against, and some were somewhere in the middle. The unanimous connection to it all, though, is that our Egyptian colleagues and community members absolutely see these people as being their ancestors. There is a unanimous position that if these individuals are taken from their burial places, then they must be researched. Otherwise, it is desecration. If individuals are on display, then their biographies are seen as being absolutely essential, And this is where the really important work of bioarchaeology comes into play. They are also extremely keen to emphasize the educational value of human remains, especially for children. And of course, in all of these situations where it is happening across the globe, our Egyptian colleagues are adamant that they want Egyptian voices to be represented in the decision-making that is happening around their display, and for that not to take place unilaterally by boards, chairs and directors without Egyptian consultation. Next slide. We asked our Egyptian colleagues, what does respect and dignity of the display of Egyptian mummified human remains means to you? Our colleagues are unanimous that bodies should never be displayed naked. Visitors should be made aware of the presence of bodies. They should also have a choice as to whether or not they choose to see the bodies on display. Of course, there are lots of conflicting thoughts in this place and recognition of differences of opinion between the East and the West. As I said again, biography is really critical. The display of dismembered body parts is problematic. We should also be acknowledging the ancient contradictions regarding the disturbance of the dead, through, for example, tomb robbery, which I mentioned earlier. And also really important to emphasize here is their humanity, that these individuals on display were once living people. Next slide. Unanimous support for non-invasive research of human remains, but where there is invasive analysis requested, it should be limited and associated with direct research questions. Deep concern was shared about the efficacies of proposed methodologies, wanting to make sure that they're confirmed with clear benefits and contributions to knowledge before any destructive work takes place, and that any research should be subject to ethics approval. Ultimately, the aim is to preserve these human remains for the future, and thus we should not be too greedy in our quest for trying to find out more information. Next slide. Very briefly, in terms of terminology and the word mummy, the majority in the room actually preferred this term, but not all knew about its etymology. Human remains is less favourable given its connotations with body parts and skeletal remains. Issues were also raised in terms of the different use and meaning of words in English versus Arabic, and the recognition for developing more specific bilingual terminology, while also recognising the need to educate the public about how this language has come to be. Next slide. We also discussed the participants' views about the way human remains are treated in archaeological fieldwork. Some clear themes emerging from this is that there are no instructions in the field for caring for human and animal remains. Every excavation develops their own system, and that there is a need for a common set of guidelines. There is also a disconnect between museums and the field. One participant said, "We need a database between the two. We need cooperation between the museum sector, the academic sector, and the ministry. And there is a need for streamlined solutions around long-term care. After studying human remains, they can go into storage or they can be reburied. But this is dependent on your taftish or your local inspectorate, your project budget, as well as bandits and animals. So lots of varying factors here. And this is actually one of the biggest ethical dilemmas of whether or not to repatriate Egyptian mummified human remains from international museum and private collections to Egypt. Just where will they go? In most cases, including our own at the Chau Chak Wing Museum, we do not have any information about the original find spot or burial location for the mummified person. So to repatriate typically means going into another museum store. Next slide. So based on this preliminary analysis with our Egyptian colleagues in Egypt, a few key themes have emerged, which I'll briefly recap on. This includes, number one, the need to rehumanize Egyptian mummified human remains, referring to them by their name, to include biographical information, to reconsider terminology and also label narratives. Number two, the importance of engaging and educating the general public with these complex ethical issues that we face as professionals. Number three, there is a need for greater cooperation and collaboration, particularly across professional, academic and government sectors within Egypt and between museum practitioners and fieldwork archaeologists. And number four, Egyptians must have a global voice and agency in the decisions that are being made. On this basis, our research and focus groups continue, especially so we can continue building up a more robust and diverse data set and to enable us to track the way attitudes shift or remain unchanged. Next slide. For example, in April this year, we held a second group of discussions with the Egyptian Australian community in Sydney. And we are returning to Egypt in November this year to hold further discussions in Cairo, the Delta, Luxor, and Aswan. Next slide. Since the rollout of phase 1 of our Human Remains Research project last year, with the removal of the body parts, there has been significant media coverage of our work, both nationally and internationally. A snapshot of what you can see here. Next slide. We're also being increasingly approached by other museums and research institutions nationally and internationally who want to learn from our work and who want to collaborate. And this is quite an achievement for a university museum to be affecting this type of national and international change. And that's exactly what we are hoping to achieve: the creation of new international benchmarks around responsible, ethical practice for the care and display of human remains, which all museums around the world will aspire to within their own local contexts. Next slide. So, in summary, the care and display of ancient Egyptian mummified human remains, and indeed human remains from all cultures in museums and collections, are among the most topical and sensitive issues for museums and their publics. There are shifting attitudes, and there is no general consensus. There are also different ancient, historical, and contemporary perspectives to consider that museums should be helping to educate museum publics about. There are also manifold voices and perspectives that must be sought and considered as we develop inclusive policies, protocols, and frameworks for their curation and engagement. But we must also consider individual cultural contexts, not only of the human remains themselves, but where they are now geographically being cared for, and to make informed decisions in close consultation with local Indigenous knowledge holders. Thank you so much, and I'd just like to acknowledge the huge team behind all of this work that we're doing, listed here on the screen, and I am looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation, Melanie. Really appreciate all your insights and all your work in sharing that with us. As I said before, please feel free to type in your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll be answering them live. Melanie, just to kind of get started on this, where can students find more resources relating to this topic and also all the work that you've been doing with the team specifically on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So we have a project website, which I believe you sent the link around to everyone beforehand.
Yep.
So we've been publishing and listing everything that we've been doing for our project there. At the end of this session, I believe you'll also be sharing a chapter that we have published, and there's a lot of further reading in there as well, which will take you to different perspectives and international literature on the topic at the same time.
Amazing. Also, I know we've gone through it quite a bit in this presentation, but I want to ask you a more personal question. What is the most fascinating aspect of your work at the Chau Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney?
Oh, that's a hard one to answer because one. I think one of the things for me is that through research, all the new stories that you discover and the new ways of looking at the past. A really good example is we recently CT scanned Merowa's coffin set. And obviously, what most people think about is what you see on the outside with the text and the decoration. But through CT scanning, you're looking at what's underneath. So, how the coffin has been constructed, the different types of wood, and the size of the planks of wood that are being used. And you can start to see things like whether or not the coffin has been reused before, or other, wood from other objects being used to make this coffin. So I just love the way that research teases out new stories and ways of seeing and interpreting the past. I think with the human remains work that we've been doing, another really key aspect of my work that I enjoy is how we're challenging the way that museums do and have done things around the care of antiquities and archaeology collections, and developing new practices and new international benchmarks for other institutions to aspire to. And another big project that I'm involved in now is how do we handle private collections that are out there of antiquities that don't have proof of chain of ownership or legal chain of ownership? Because the way that many antiquities have come into Australia have often been through inheritance and objects being passed down, soldiers in the war, medical doctors, senior uni alumni graduates. That's how a lot of our collection has actually been formed in more recent times. But, the landscape's changing now. So how can we implement a more responsible and ethical practice around working with source countries to develop better pathways that, are done together rather than in museums making decisions on behalf of other people?
Amazing, thank you. And I really love this more communal sort of approach in the project as well. We have one question. How often are remains mistreated? And then there's a second part. Further, could you talk about the mistreatment of bog bodies because they're damaged in the past?
Okay, the first question is a very big one. Are you talking about mistreatment today, or are you talking about mistreatment in the past? And yeah, can I get
I
some?
believe so. Olivia, please feel free to elaborate on that when you get a chance.
I think, I guess a better way of looking at that, or thinking about that question, is how human remains collections have been formed around the world. And we haven't collected human remains. Well, actually, there was a collection. So the two mummified hands that you saw came about in an acquisition about less than 10 years ago. And that was through a medical doctor in Egypt who had collected sort of souvenirs of his time there, and then his family had kept everything preserved in a vitrine. And that was donated to us, less than 10 years ago that I mentioned. But going back, that was based on the historical time in Egypt when the antiquities market was very much about helping to profit out of body parts and bodies themselves. And it wasn't just Western visitors coming to Egypt to do this, it was also within Egypt itself. And there's a really fabulous book by Kim Reholt and Frederick Hagen about the antiquities market in Egypt during this sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, it very much talks about this network at that time between Egyptian traders and also Westerners coming in to purchase human remains. But as I said, it goes back to the ancient times, and tomb robbery was prolific in ancient Egypt. And, I've worked at the site of Amarna, excavating human remains in the cemeteries there. And you'll actually see that bodies have been very targeted. You can tell that people knew exactly where they were going back to steal from, because they specifically knew what was where. And then we sometimes would find undisturbed human remains where there were no amulets or no burial goods there. But the ones that, they must have realized had more precious interments with them have been stolen. So we can't detach that story about the contradictions in the ancient world, what's happened in historical times, and then how we respond to it today.
Of course, thank you. I really appreciate that answer. And last question from Sharon. In the figures you showed as part of the report, and particularly the survey about who owns the past, numbers did not add up to 100, whether several surveys or multiple questions as part of that.
We had a control response. So what would have happened typically is that we would always collect more than the targeted amount, but then not everyone always filled out the survey or finished the survey. So that's why we have controlled responses there to make it equal the full amount. But I'd be interested to see which one didn't add up, because we have published on this and it's been rigorously reviewed. So happy for you to point out the exact slide, and I can have a look later and get back to you.
And we will also be sharing all that extra resources afterwards as well for everyone's reference. Okay. Okay, last one, and I know we've got a few, but really need to make it last one. Do you think there will ever be a time when having human remains in museums will be prohibited? And if so, what will the role of human remains be in understanding the past?
Yeah, so that's already happening. There are already museums around the world that don't display human remains. And as I mentioned, there's no consensus. Or they do display some from some time periods and not others. So a really good example is in the Staatlich Museum in Munich. So they are based on the premise that they'll only display human remains from the Roman period and after, because there's textual evidence to say that in antiquity, they used to display the bodies in the houses for people to visit before burial happened. So then the other human remains they have in their collection before that time period are not on display. But what is kind of a contradiction in this that has been quite criticised is why they would still then display funerary items from the burial. And how is that any different? If you're not going to display the human remains, then why are you choosing to display the burial goods with them? The Manchester Museum in the past have completely taken the bodies from display or covered them up, and that caused a great outcry. As I said, there's a lot of bearing displays that people have done around the world. It doesn't mean research can't still happen, and this is why it's really important to have guidelines so that museums have a position on their approach and they can justify why they've chosen to do things a certain way, rather than being like a swinging pendulum. Even though, as I mentioned, attitudes keep shifting, and that's why we have to keep on tracking attitudinal responses, but we have to keep up with the times as well. So that is another conflicting issue for us is, we remove the body parts from display. If you look at our guidelines, you'll see that we're still open on a case-by-case basis to research being undertaken on them and for people to view them in consultation with dissent communities as well. So that's not what ethics is. It's not about yes or no. It's about how to navigate that tricky grey area in between.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Just conscious of time, so I'll move on to the next one. But really, thank you so much for taking the time and answering such with such detail to participants' questions. Okay, thank you so much. Before you leave, everyone, we would really love to hear your thoughts on today's talk. If you could please fill in the evaluation survey, that would be fantastic. My colleague Isla has also shared that link into the chat. The reason for the evaluation is to really help us improve and incorporate more ancient history topics in the future. So please feel free to add any ideas that you might have. I'll keep this slide up for a few more minutes. And while you're completing the evaluation survey, I would like to also reinstate that tonight's talk is being recorded and we will be sharing a copy with everyone afterwards for the reference. And also Melanie has kindly agreed to share her slides in addition to the extra resources that will go out once the recording is ready. So you'll get all that information coming through over the next fortnight. All right. To stay up to date with any upcoming events and similar opportunities that we have, you can also sign up to our faculty's Participate High School newsletter. This is where we share events like this and also any resources or any high school engagement or outreach initiatives that are coming up. You can sign up by scanning the QR code on the screen. Again, I'll leave it up for a little bit. Thank you so much, Olivia. And once again, a big thank you to everyone for attending. We hope you found it helpful for your upcoming assessments, and we would very much like to see you very soon. A massive thank you to Melanie and Craig for all the work in setting this up, research, presentation, and of course, my colleague Isla for being in the background and helping us with the webinar. I hope everyone has a fabulous night ahead, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.